Welcome on behalf of the Rhinebeck Reformed Church and the Institute of Advanced Theology at the Bard College. We welcome you to this medium where we're going to continue our journey of learning and spiritual and intellectual growth by exploring the topic of liberation theology. We are delighted that we're going to have Dr. Bruce Chilton, who has become an academic and spiritual mentor not only to this congregation, but to so many through his rigorous scholarship, lead us in these discussions. We know that during ordinary times we would be meeting in Cordes Hall in order to break bread and to then be fed spiritually and intellectually, but hopefully soon we'll be able to get together, and we welcome you and we thank you for being a faithful supporter. For those who are tuning in for the first time, I'd like to share that Dr. Bruce Chilton is the Bernard Iddings Bell Professor of Religion at the Bard College, and he was a former Lillian Claus Professor of New Testament Theology and Religion and History at Yale University. He is one of the preeminent New Testament scholars in the world. Among his notable books are Rabbi Paul, Rabbi Jesus, and Abraham's Curse, The Roots of Violence in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Without further ado, we're delighted to defer this part now to Dr. Bruce Chilton. Enjoy the lecture.
Thank you very much, Luis, and thank you for your hospitality. Thank you for joining us, whether we made our acquaintance first through the Lunch and Learn program or through the Institute of Advanced Theology. I'm afraid the menu is a little bit sparer because it is only me. But we look forward to the time when we'll be able to extend the service to its usual conviviality. The other thing that we're missing, because of the particular setup that we're required to use, is that we don't have the benefit of discussion afterward, but I hope you will store up your questions against the day when we can get together again and explore whatever it is we need to investigate further. In discussion with Luis Perez, we came to the conclusion that liberation theology would be an appropriate topic this particular autumn, in that most of us feel, not only as a matter of comic relief, but at a deep level, most of us feel a need for liberation, a need for getting out of a condition which now collectively does oppress us in a variety of ways, and oppresses us in a manner that also has forced us to consider the ways in which there's a disproportionate burden on differing parts of our population. The situation we confront is very similar to that confronted by those thinkers who developed the movement called liberation theology. One of them was named Leonardo Buff. He referred back to his participation in the movement of liberation theology, which goes back to the late 1960s. But he did so in an especially moving way in a speech that he made in 2001. In association with this presentation, I do have a little handout, and it's going to be available on the website of the Rhinebeck Reformed Church, so you'll be able to check it. But I'm going to read those sections which are particularly important so that you'll be able to follow even without it to hand. So in his speech of 2001, Leonardo Buff referred back to the work that he had done as a Brazilian theologian, especially since 1968. But then he also calls attention to what most theologians of this movement have considered to be the key biblical passage in understanding liberation and in understanding why liberation is not only economic and political, it is both those things, but it's also theological, for the most profound reason that can be imagined, namely, God seeks the liberation of his people. And so Buff said, only announcing a vivid and liberating God, allied with the poor and the excluded, can we, without cynicism and in truth, say he is effectively a good and merciful God. The words of the Exodus were updated for our generation. I have heard the oppression of my people. I have heard their screams of affliction. I have known their suffering. I have come down to free them. Now go, for I send you, God says to Moses, to free my people. Those words were addressed to each one of us, to each church, to each conscience, which is minimally ethical and humanitarian. Buff has a conception that the Exodus story is everyone's story, and that it speaks to us not only of our liberation, but of the task of liberation which each of us has as a human being. It addresses our conscience, not only our particular conditions that we might be trying to overcome. I would like to focus especially on words that come from inside this passage of the Exodus, chapter 3, that Buff here cites, but that he actually skipped over in his quotation. A fair enough thing, but I find these words especially interesting for a reason I'll explain. In verse 9 of chapter 3, God says to Moses, when he's calling him to lead his people out of Egypt, I have seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Oppression is at the center of the Exodus story in two different angles. On the one hand, there's the angle of the oppression that is causing the Hebrew people to suffer. And on the other hand, there is the oppression which is perpetrated by the master culture, which is enslaving them. A moment's pause to give fair play to the Egyptians. Egypt was one of the great civilizations of the ancient world. It stands alongside the civilizations of China and of the Aztec and of the Inca in terms of its ancient sources and its longevity. But like all of these great ancient cultures, it also practiced slavery. Slavery was not an oddity within the ancient world. Those who founded cities, much less empires, thought that slavery was simply a necessary part of their rule. And for that reason, slavery is actually written in to the literature of antiquity. There's been a great deal of discussion lately, and rightly, around the issue of slavery in American culture. One of the reasons that it persisted beyond the point where you would have thought that those who founded our nation would have stopped it is that they were trying to take their lead from the sources of ancient Greece, Athenian democracy, and ancient Rome, the great republic before the empire. But Greece and Rome practiced slavery too. It simply, to many people, appeared to be endemic to civilization. So the fact that the Egyptians indeed practiced slavery does not make them an aberration. Quite the contrary. It means that they are a common or garden variety ancient culture. For that very reason, the text is talking about a structure of society which was very well known. It was not speaking of the Egyptians as if they were naturally more cruel than anyone else. It is rather taking Egypt as being a supreme example of what an alleged civilization can get up to. And it's interesting that within this particular narrative, just as the Egyptians stand for civilization, so the oppressed peoples stand for those who are enslaved. That's worth noting too, because many people in our culture today take the scriptures of Israel as if they were always the writings of a people who was in control, a people that was powerful, a people that could oppress others. Some of the most formative moments of the scriptures that we call the Old Testament come from moments of extraordinary powerlessness. In fact, within most of this cycle of stories referring to the Exodus, the people of Israel aren't even called the people of Israel. They are called Hebrews by the Egyptians, referring not only to their language, but also to their subjugated status. The story of the Exodus is about an oppressed people recovering its identity, to be its own people, to name its own ancestors, not to have them removed entirely from their memory, because the Egyptians are in fact described as so treating the Israelites that had they continued to do what they were doing, the result would have been cultural genocide. The result would have been a lack of awareness of where we as a people came from and how we might continue to pursue our identity and the promise of our legacy. So in Exodus chapter 1, verse 22, chapter 1 tells us early on where this is leading, where slavery goes. Then, in verse 22, Pharaoh commanded to all the people, "Every son that is born you shall throw into the Nile, and every daughter you shall keep alive." Notice the text doesn't even say every son of the Israelites. It doesn't even say every son of the Hebrews. It just says every son, as if we're not even going to name them. Because the effort here is to keep only the females. The idea is the legacy of Israel comes through the male line, and therefore we can eliminate this culture. It's worth bearing in mind, because sometimes modern sensibilities want to take the part of the Egyptians and say, why is the story so hard on the Egyptians? Because the story of slavery is not only the story of forced labor. It's the story of an attempt to eliminate people, literally, and by means of violence. And the story wishes the remembrance of that suffering to stay with the people of Israel and to influence the way in which they conduct themselves. And that's why this first angle under which I want to look at the Exodus is the angle of the remembrance of suffering, which is sometimes brought to expression literally as a reminder not to forget. So in chapter 13, verse 3 of Exodus, Moses said to the people, "Remember this day when you came out of Egypt, out of the place of bondage, because with strength of hand Yahweh brought you out from this." Egypt and bondage are made synonyms. This is a story of how we got out of slavery and a reminder that we got out of that slavery not merely by our own power. It was something that Yahweh wanted for his people, which is why it happened. And when Moses says to remember this, he does so within the setting of the celebration that we now call Passover. It's worth considering that the whole story of the Exodus has folded within it also all of the rituals which people are to be kept when Israel actually settles in the land. So the ritual is there inside the story. The story comes to expression in the ritual. And that is the reason for which the Exodus story is a combination of reflection on experience, on relating events, and also a liturgical manual for how to go about bringing this to life, making it vivid in one's memory. That frequently happens in biblical texts, but the case of the Exodus and Passover is exceptional for the very long run of material which is brought together into a single cycle, showing the importance of the memory of being liberated from bondage. This command to remember can go far beyond the moment of Passover. So, for example, in the book of Deuteronomy, there's a moment when Yahweh says, "You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt." Those words in Deuteronomy were written when Israel was in a privileged position. When the book of Deuteronomy was written, finally, Israel had a king. Israel had a central government. Israel had an army. It might well have been a moment when people might think, wouldn't it be good to forget that we were slaves? Wouldn't it be wonderful just to think of ourselves as always in charge, as a kind of master race? Yahweh insists, no, that's exactly the moment you remember you were a slave. You were a slave in the land of Egypt because your ancestors were, you were. And Yahweh your God brought you out with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. Very interesting. The same language of Passover is echoed in the book of Deuteronomy, but in a different setting, in a setting in which people are being told, interestingly, how to keep the Sabbath, how to rest on the Sabbath day. Because at this point in Deuteronomy 5:15, Yahweh is saying, when you rest, make sure your slaves also rest. You're not to be in the position where you rest and you force your slaves to work extra for you. In fact, you should be giving them relief just as you give yourself relief. Does this mean that the book of Deuteronomy eliminates slavery? It does not. I mentioned earlier that ancient civilizations took slavery to be a necessary institution in order for them to perpetuate themselves, defend their boundaries, make for the degree of prosperity that they could achieve. It would take centuries for slavery to be removed from most developed societies. And indeed, next time we meet, I would like to talk about the moral force which led to that, which led to emancipation from slavery. But that's a modern story. It's not an ancient story. And for the moment, I just want to stay within the ambit of the immediate influence of this story of Exodus. The point is, Deuteronomy shows us that even in those cases where it did not result in the elimination of slavery, as one might have hoped, it did nonetheless lead to the very strong imperative: you are to teach your children, your progeny, to treat slaves as if they were people. That in itself is a major step forward. Before we can speak of the emancipation of slavery, the reduction of that institution of bondage, we have to talk about the way in which one person regards another And this principle of Exodus was one of the major reasons for which, within Israel, the understanding emerged that because we ourselves were slaves, we know that our humanity was in bondage. Therefore, others who are in bondage must be understood to be human as well. And what we see after the period of the book of Deuteronomy is exactly an increasing awareness of this basic principle that one person owes another true regard as a human being. And so, in the book of Zechariah, a statement which we'll see in a moment leads to a sentiment very much like the teaching of Jesus. We find the statement in Zechariah chapter 7, verse 9. Yahweh of armies says this: judge true judgment, show mercy and compassion one to another, and do not oppress widow or orphan, the stranger or the poor, and do not devise evil in your heart one against another. It is easy to regard the poor as not only substandard, but subhuman. Straightforward to see foreigners as not worthy of justice. Easy to overlook people who are of reduced status, like widows and orphans. It happens in human societies regularly. It happens in our society. But the principle of Exodus says, no, such people are akin to us when we were in bondage. And therefore, we don't have the right to withhold justice from them. It becomes a collective obligation to see to it that justice is offered to human beings because they are human beings. There is no further explanation necessary to make that appeal to justice. In fact, it's of great interest that within the last text I want to refer to under this angle of oppression as having suffered, in the book of Leviticus, a very famous principle is articulated, and it's in the context of what happens when you go to a court and justice is delivered. The principle here in Leviticus is that when that happens, when you're in dispute with someone else, when the dispute is over, you are not to hold a grudge against that person. Adjudicated is adjudicated. You shall not, the text reads, this is Leviticus 19:18, you shall not take vengeance. Once the court has decided, vengeance ends. You shall not take vengeance or remain hostile with the children of my people, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am Yahweh. Why does Yahweh say, you shall love your neighbor as yourself? Then, because God is saying, it's exactly in the context when you are in dispute with someone else, and that dispute has been peaceably adjudicated, that you should accept the result, understanding that you owe that person exactly the kind of deference you owe yourself, because you both were once slaves. Now you are not. So under the angle of collective suffering, this oppression that was meted out against the Hebrews, as they were called, in slavery, results in a principle of collective justice, which liberation theologians, I think, are entirely correct to call our attention to. Because there is a tendency within developed societies in the West to imagine that religious faith is purely a matter of individual preference and belief. Within this whole cycle of Exodus, the insistence comes through, the story is actually about justice, about how justice is achieved, and about understanding that knowing where you came from enables you now to be able to relate to one another as God would have you do. Now that's the angle of suffering as is experienced by those who are in the position of bondage. Now let's talk about these Egyptians. I mentioned already that there's a tendency in the modern world to think of the Egyptians as hard done by in this story, and I wouldn't deny for a moment that there is an element of legendary exaggeration going on within the whole Exodus narrative. When you put together history, reminiscence, experience, and liturgy, yes, you're going to get a degree of exaggeration. It happens persistently. But at the same time, it's important to be aware of why the text says what it has to say. And to bear in mind that slavery in this narrative is being depicted as a fierce and lethal and genocidal institution from which Israel needs relief. But the other feature about the Egyptians, which sometimes perplexes modern readers, is they don't quit. They just seem to be absolutely incredibly stupid. And that is, in fact, a deliberate theme. And it's the other angle I would like to look at this story from. The angle that says, why does someone who oppresses continue the oppression even when it's perfectly obvious that it's causing pain not only to the people enslaved, but also to the enslavers? How can they possibly be so dim? And the Exodus story deliberately does portray Pharaoh and his entourage in this way. I'm not going to refer to all 10 plagues as they are traditionally enumerated. It's a great story. You can go to a Passover or Haggadah and hear about all the 10 plagues if you like. I just want to refer to 3 of them because they illustrate in a crucial way the manner in which oppressors typically see themselves as entitled to oppress. So entitled to oppress that even when they suffer for their own oppression, they continue doing it. And so there's the example in Exodus chapter 7, verse 21, referring to the waters in the greatest river in Egypt. And the fish of the Nile died, and the Nile stagnated, and the Egyptians could not drink the water from the Nile. What is Pharaoh's response? The text says he went into his palace, because in his palace he had water stored. And he told the other people in Egypt that they should just go and find wells. So they go and they have to dig. Pharaoh thinks he's perfectly all right. So the first response is simply to attempt to tough it out on the assumption that I have every right to oppress these Hebrews. They have no right to be asking me to be let go in order to worship their God. Even if it means poisoned water, I am not going to stop doing that, because after all, I don't have to drink it. I don't have to drink it. I suppose that many people in the United States who might have done something about the water in Flint, Michigan, could have reacted differently if they were in a position where they had to drink the water. And I suppose it is the case that in the many, many parts of this country where water is polluted to the point that it cannot safely be drunk, that situation would be reversed if the water supply were in a more privileged community. Entitlement causes you to think, I have such a right to doing what I'm doing right now that certain other people are dispensable as compared not only to my needs, but also as compared to my convenience. So Pharaoh, first of all, reacts simply by toughing it out. And I want to make the comparison between that and the way in which there was an overwhelming lack of response to the problems of the water in Flint, Michigan, to point out that entitlement is not a uniquely Egyptian problem, and that it afflicts all of those who govern from a position of privilege. So we constantly have to correct that tendency to feel entitled to oppress with an understanding of what the remembrance of oppression should really cause us to do. So what will convince Pharaoh? Well, then we're told, this is in Exodus chapter 9, verse 25, about a tremendous storm. The hail struck all the land of Egypt, and all that was in the field from man to beast. The hail hit every plant of the field and broke every tree. What does Pharaoh do now? Pharaoh now gets a little panicky, because after all, in the story, it's the whole land of Egypt. It goes on to say, well, except Goshen, which is where the Hebrews lived. I promised you exaggeration. Whole land is up. Pharaoh now says, okay, Moses, why don't we arrange for you to be able to leave? And why don't we have you pray, and then once you've done that, and this storm is passed, we're going to let you go. And guess what? He can't be trusted. He just backwards. He just says, yeah, I see that there's a connection between my practice of slavery in this case and the way in which my land is suffering, says I'm going to act on that awareness by letting you go, and then does not do it. That may seem impossible behavior. It may seem unnatural. But then again, it may remind you of a great nation which once agreed to an accord in Paris to deal with climate change, and then simply left the accord. Why? Is it because the climate is not changing? Is it because there are fewer storms in the Gulf? Or fewer fires in now the Northwest, as well as the West? How is it we can act in such a way that we know something is dangerous, we know something is against our best interest, yet we feel entitled to pursue the same activity? It is something very interesting and mysterious about what I would call collective human sinfulness. It's connected with denial, with the tendency of people to say, oh, that little problem which I noticed in my elbow is going to go away. I'll stop playing tennis. And then, oh, I'll stop doing carpentry. And then finally I have to admit, I have to go see about the problem in my elbow. That human denial I regard as being entirely normal, natural, and even intelligent. That is to say, insofar as you can deny something and it really does go away, well, you're ahead of the game. But alas, most of us have to realize denial sometimes is not a good option at all. But this is something beyond denial, and it usually happens at a collective level. Usually at a collective level, human societies can think that they can basically will reality away. That what they know very well is a threat to them doesn't have to be coped with. That they can make an agreement and simply backward that agreement without there being consequences. So the problem of Pharaoh did not end with Pharaoh. problem of Pharaoh comes whenever you have a community which enjoys the benefits of prosperity and which can come to see them as being entitlements, that they can always turn to and benefit from, no matter what the consequences might be. Well, of course, finally, Pharaoh does yield. Kind of. When does it? When he faces what he has to in Exodus 11, verse 5. When it's explained, all firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die. From the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits upon his throne, to the firstborn of the maidservant at the mill, and the firstborn of beasts. By the way, do you notice the symmetry between that moment of the Passover and the very beginning of the story in chapter 1, when the Pharaoh had insisted that the male children of Israel should be killed? The story is very carefully crafted to insist that what you do to others comes back to you every time. You might delay it, you might defer it, you might try to evade it, but this is basically embedded within the very structure of reality. And so then, finally, Pharaoh apparently agrees. He does let the Israelites go, but then, of course, he has his army, complete with cavalry and chariots, chase after them. That's why we have that final scene that, under certain circumstances, entitlement can only end by means of destruction. The only thing that's going to stop the armies of Pharaoh annihilating the Israelites is if the army of Pharaoh is completely stopped, which is what the story of the Exodus celebrates. So within this Exodus cycle, the two angles on oppression deal with the identity each of us has as, if I can put it this way, a natural-born slave. That is, freedom is not something that comes our way because of our merit. We are born in conditions in which others can, and sometimes do, take advantage of us. In order for us to be freed of that, we need something larger than ourselves. And that's precisely what the book of Exodus refers to. And it also refers to what it is that attempts to enslave people. What attempts to enslave people is the tendency to think, oh, I was never a slave. I was different. I belong to the master race. Everyone else serves me. And I'm entitled to any benefit that comes my way, no matter what the cost to others, even myself. Both of those are brought together in the story of the Exodus. And they raise the question, how is it that people can overcome that second tendency, that tendency of entitlement? That's why I want to talk next time about the story of how in the United States slavery was ultimately defeated. What principles were used there? They were definitely Exodus principles. There's no question about that whatsoever. But there is also something added in. An add-on that permits change to occur. And that basis of change is what I would like to focus on next time, when I hope you're able to join us. Thank you very much for being with us today. Take care.